Can you believe that it's been over 12 years since Nissan introduced a sort of affordable electric car for the common folk to drive? Since then, everyone else has kind of filled in the gaps. Porsche, Mercedes, BMW, but noticeably absent, fancy cars, Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royce, and Maybach. Well, apparently, that is now changing. Okay, so this development is all fine and good, but what exactly is it? Well, it is a Maybach that is fully electric. The Maybach EQS 680. And one of the benefits about having the numbers is you no longer have to say SUV to differentiate between the sedan and the SUV version of a Mercedes electric vehicle. Now that brings us to one of the most obvious questions. Just look at it. Is it based on the Mercedes Benz EQS SUV? Answer is yes. And it's not just the look of the vehicle, meaning the shape, it's also a number of the bits on the outside. And this brings us to one of the most important differentiators of Maybachs. Look at the Maybach S580. We've driven that car, and the biggest difference between it and an S-Class is the length of the vehicle. The wheelbase changes significantly in that car. Here, they didn't do that trick. Brings us to the obvious question of why. Well, this is an SUV, that's a sedan. Here you have more flexibility of being able to move the rear seats, because that's the focus of a Maybach, move them back without compromising the structural rigidity of the car. So in reality, we're trading a little bit of storage space and removing the third row because this is not meant to be a practical vehicle and making it more of a fancy vehicle. But then there's the fact that this is based on an EV platform, which in itself has a packaging trick. These, you can put the wheels farther out to the edge of the car, which means there's more room to package. I don't want to say people and dogs because this is not the kind of vehicle you're going to have a lot of dogs in. Let's just say heads of state. And that gets us to the propulsion system, which it does share with the EQS SUV, but also with the EQS AMG sedan. You see, this has the same dual motor all-wheel drive system and the same 108.4 kilowatt-hour battery. But where it changes is the components come from the EQS AMG rather than the EQS SUV. So that means the motor, the inverter, as well as the formulation of the battery is from the AMG side of the house, not from the regular Mercedes Benz side of the house. Now, as you can imagine, that would have an impact on the output. In the EQS SUV, the 580, that one's 400 kilowatts. This is significantly more at 484. That translates to about 649 horsepower. Now, of course, we have to have the logistical discussion of this being an EV, and that would be range. And there I have nothing to share with you because the US EPA has not rated this yet, so we'll have to put a pin in that, come back to this discussion when we drive the car. Then there's the charging architecture of the vehicle itself. That hasn't changed from the EQS SUV. So in other words, it's not the 800-volt architecture. So going from 10 to 80% would take 32 minutes. Now let's press on to the bits that make this a Maybach. First stop would be the wheels. Notice the monoblocks. You guys know I am a sucker for monoblocks. There are multiple designs on offer, as well as multiple wheel sizes. So there's going to be a 21, a 22, and they tell me there may be a 23. They haven't confirmed that. Then, just looking at it, yes, it's a two-tone. Not exactly my cup of tea, but this is one of the things that make Maybach stand out. But I do have to say there is a party trick with this two-tone. Yes, we saw it was very expensive in the S580. This alone is like a $13,000 option in the S580. This one, like the S580 Maybach, has a pinstripe. But the pinstripe is not something that's taped onto the car. It is painted onto the car, so you do not feel a difference in the paint with the stripe. It is part of the two-tone package. Then we have to pick up our discussion on the design, and I will admit this looks very much like an EQS 580 SUV. However, they've made a lot of tweaks, so this is all a function of very small changes. Remember the sketch we saw of this about a year ago? This is that car in real life, even down to the color they've chosen to debut here in Portugal. So yes, they've changed the grille here. Not that an EV really needs a grille, so the idea is to have it more upright. I never like to tell you what you guys can see in design, but this, it's more, I guess bold would be the way to go. But then there is something that I am a complete sucker for, and that is the stand-up hood ornament. This, I don't know what it is, but when I think Mercedes, I think stand-up hood ornament. I want to look down the road and see the star and laurel, because there's something, I guess with a Maybach, there's something baller about it. Then there's something technical, something I really don't love. You look at cars nowadays, at least in the US, and they have the logo, whatever it is, maybe not a star and laurel, but other cars as well, they light them up. Turns out that is mandated by the country the car is sold in. So Europe, you couldn't do that. That's why these and other cars from other manufacturers weren't illuminated. Now they can be. Are they going to illuminate this? Probably at some point. Then, continuing the theme of a lot of small changes, notice the side of the vehicle. It looks more ostentatious. That's because they have this satin finish chrome that goes around the daylight opening. And then they add the Maybach logo in the back on the D pillar. This would be on a C pillar in an S580 Maybach. Now that, some people might say, would clash with the Mercedes logo on the wheel over there. But remember, this is no longer a standalone car. This is a Mercedes Maybach, hence the two go together. Then looking at the back here, notice a design trick they did with the taillights. So the idea is to separate these things out by small, like understated design touches. It's not just all of this detail of adding the chrome or changing the grille. And here it's almost like a ribbon that runs through the light signature on the rear of the car. Then speaking of the rear of the car, this is where we have to get to the business end of it. So inside, this is where there is a significant difference between this and an EQS 580 SUV. First and most obvious thing one would notice are the seats. Now these aren't just like reupholstered seats from an EQS SUV. These are seats from a Maybach, both front and rear. These are on offer as this 4-place package here, as well as a 5-place seating package. But the big thing to notice here, remember we talked about that wheelbase trick? The seat, it physically is sitting farther back, kind of like the BMW XM that we drove recently, where my shoulder is now almost in line with or behind the C-pillar of the car. And then speaking of the C-pillar, something we do have to talk about, you will notice these unusual speakers that are in the C-pillar. Another big difference between this and an EQS 580 SUV, it's got a 4D Burmester sound, and they've added some more speakers, the most noticeable being these lit speakers in the C-pillar. Very cool party trick. And then speaking of lights, I can go into one of the many tablets I have back here. So you can see it's the Mercedes Benz UX here. We can do things like change the setting. Let's say for the sake of discussion, I want to change the ambient lighting in the car. I go into ambient lighting. I can change the brightness, the effects, as well as the color. Right now, I'm on blue, which is my favorite color. Let's say for the sake of discussion, I want to make it warmer. We'll make it a version of red. I'm trying to make it red, but oh no, that's yellow, and that's still pink, and it just doesn't want to do red. There's red. Okay, we finally have red. But the idea is this is part of the 4-place seating package. Then there is a very obnoxious Qi wireless charger, and then something not so obnoxious but very ostentatious, champagne flutes. These are actually embedded into the car so they won't move around. And then we have our own picnic tables back here. Something interesting about the picnic tables here, notice they're on an angle. And at first I looked at that and I'm like, maybe they were missing something here, but apparently this is by design because these really aren't meant for eating. They're meant for putting a laptop, and let's say for the sake of discussion, you're driving around, you know, London or the Orchard Road in Singapore or down Fifth Avenue in New York, and you're trying to work on your computer and your driver stops short, the computer will not fly into the front of the vehicle. Now let's stow this away and press on to some other details. One of the biggest things you would notice, the tactile feel, color, and trim, all unusual in a Maybach. And I would say that in a good way. Like for example, the headliner is leather. It's not faux suede, it's leather to match the rest of the car. Now, of course, this car can be kind of bespoke built, or one can pick out a different kind of headliner. Then you will notice in the rear of the vehicle, it literally has everything, and the kitchen sink. That includes I wouldn't call it a refrigerator, let's call it a cool box, because it's designed to cool drinks. And then, of course, this being a Maybach, we have to hit this button here, and the seat in front of me moves forward, and the seat back tilts forward. This includes pillows. In this case, they are leather. If you may remember in the S580 Maybach that we drove recently, that one had suede pillows. Then the headrest goes down to allow more room for the seat to pick up and move further forward. Then it starts picking up my legs with the footrest. And oh, by the way, I knew I was shooting a very fancy car, so I wore my Rolling Stone socks for you guys. So even I, a guy who prefers to shift his own gears, has to admit this is a flash place to be. There are a couple of more details that make that a reality. Like, notice the wood. This one has the aluminum lines in the wood like other Maybachs, and the leather we talked about in the headliner, it extends everywhere. So it's extended leather throughout the interior. It's around the door panels, it's around the window openings, it's even all the way down the B-pillar. Then rounding all this out is, of course, the dashboard, and there it's the same hyperscreen that we've seen in the EQS as well as the EQS SUV. Here, all the hardware is the same. It's the software and how they render some of the images digitally that's different in the Maybach. Speaking of some other differences in the Maybach, so the changes extend underneath the car as well. So remember the ICE GLS that we drove back in California? Yes, that car had an AMG tuned engine, but it had a Maybach tuned suspension, meaning there was a setting that was for Maybach alone. And the idea there was to focus the ride quality more on the rear of the vehicle. So it was compliant and had composure all in one. We haven't driven this car yet, so I can't tell you what the setting on this one will be, but it will have that same Maybach setting. Now, rounding all of this out is something specific to an electric vehicle, and that is the sound or lack thereof. We've seen in BMWs the iconic sounds or the sport Taycan sound in the Porsche. Here they're doing the same thing, and obviously it's called a Maybach sound. It is unique to the vehicle if one would want to sound. Now, that brings us to the point of the episode where we can't ask what we've learned today because this is just a preview, kind of a tech review of the car before we get to drive it, which will most likely be in Q4 of this year. And that brings us to the wish list. And here, I'm going to renew something that we talked about in our Maybach S-Class episodes. And there, it's the dashboard, at least the option to have something more analog, something with knobs and toggle switches. I get why Mercedes and Maybach have done this thing with the screens. A, it's what the kids want nowadays. And B, yes, it's cheaper to take something that you have already in another vehicle and bring it here. But the missed opportunity is this. By having knobs and toggle switches that are knurled, that have a certain tactile feel, you're missing an opportunity to convey luxury. And then there's the kind of people that buy these things. This is gonna be like 250 grand or more. That's at least my guess. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, the option of having IWC designed and branded gauges in the car as well as a clock, and then maybe a screen, let's call it 35 grand. I'm willing to bet that the take rate on that option would be very high because it would put a bigger delta between the EQS SUV and the Maybach EQS 680. But I'm just one man, and this is the point of the episode, that I turn around to you guys to opine in the comments below, or via our social media, MotoManTV, all one word, MotoManTV, all one word, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And with that, if you got value out of this episode, I would greatly appreciate you sharing them with all your friends on your socials. Until I see you in the next episode, bis später.